Northern France, 22nd August, 1943. A German motorcycle courier steers his BMW R75 around a bend on the road between Amiens and Abbeville. Throttle open, dispatch case strapped tight to the fuel tank. He barely registers the grey limestone boulder at the roadside. Natural debris, unremarkable, precisely where such a rock ought to be. 3 meters behind him, the boulder erupts. The blast wave catches the motorcycle's rear wheel, sends machine and rider tumbling into the ditch. The dispatch case, containing movement orders for an entire panzer division, lies split open in the morning light. What the courier never knew, what his commanders would never suspect, was that the rock had been placed there deliberately. 2 nights earlier, a French resistance operative had swapped an actual boulder for something that looked identical, weighed identical, felt identical to the touch. Inside a thin shell of plaster and real stone aggregate sat 680 grams of plastic explosive, a pressure-release detonator, and the patient calculations of the Special Operations Executive's most imaginative camouflage experts. This was sabotage refined to an art form so subtle that the enemy rarely understood what had killed them. The British genius for clandestine warfare has manifested in many forms: encrypted signals, false intelligence, audacious commando raids. But perhaps nowhere was the combination of technical ingenuity and psychological cunning more perfectly expressed than in the humble fake rock. It embodied a principle that would define special operations for the remainder of the war. The most devastating weapons are often those the enemy never sees coming, never recognizes even after they've struck, never learns to defend against, because they cannot believe such a thing exists. This is the story of how British engineers turned geology into weaponry, how ordinary stones became instruments of extraordinary disruption, and how a device so simple in concept required such sophisticated execution that even 70 years later, the full extent of its deployment remains partially classified. It is a story of materials, science, fieldcraft, and the calculated exploitation of human psychology. Above all, it is a reminder that in warfare, the imagination can be as lethal as any gun. By early 1941, the Special Operations Executive faced a persistent operational challenge that threatened the effectiveness of resistance networks across occupied Europe. Sabotage operations required explosives, but delivering them to resistance fighters without arousing suspicion had become increasingly difficult. German security measures had intensified, checkpoints multiplied, random searches of vehicles, homes, and persons became routine. Resistance members caught carrying obvious military equipment faced immediate execution, and the Gestapo had grown alarmingly skilled at identifying concealed weapons and explosives through a combination of physical searches, informants, and simple pattern recognition. Traditional methods of camouflage, false compartments in lorries, hollowed books, modified household items, were known to German counterintelligence. Manuals circulated amongst occupation forces, specifically detailing these hiding places. Training films showed soldiers precisely where to look, what to feel for, how to recognize the telltale weight distribution of a modified object. The problem intensified in rural areas where resistance activity was most valuable. Bridges needed destroying, railway lines required cutting, fuel depots made tempting targets. But in villages and countryside, strangers attracted attention. Unusual objects provoked questions, and the arrival of anything that looked remotely military in origin triggered investigations. airdrops of supplies, whilst essential, created their own difficulties. Drop zones required coordination, created noise and light, left evidence on the ground, and drew German patrols the following morning. Recovered equipment then needed hiding, transportation, concealment during daylight hours. The mathematics were unforgiving. Every additional handling increased risk of discovery. Every person involved increased the probability of betrayal or error. Every unusual object in a farmhouse or barn potentially meant death for an entire family. British planners calculated that roughly 40% of resistance cells compromised between 1940 and early 1941 had been discovered through the capture of obviously military equipment during routine searches rather than through deliberate betrayal. The explosives themselves, regardless of their effectiveness, had become a liability equal to their value as weapons. What resistance operations needed was a delivery system that bypassed suspicion entirely, that could sit in plain sight without triggering the trained responses of German security personnel, that appeared so completely natural to its environment that even methodical inspection would reveal nothing unusual. The explosive needed to be simultaneously invisible and ubiquitous, something so ordinary that its presence raised no questions, something that could be abandoned if necessary without loss of a tactical advantage, positioned days or weeks before use without degradation, and deployed by untrained operatives without specialized tools or extensive preparation. Chemical camouflage, making explosives smell like soap or food, had been attempted and failed. Dogs and chemical tests defeated it. Miniaturization helped, but created insufficient blast effect for worthwhile targets. The solution required rethinking the fundamental approach to concealment. Instead of hiding the explosive inside something suspicious that must then be explained away, British engineers decided to hide it inside something that explanation itself would seem absurd, an ordinary rock. The concept emerged from meetings at Station 9, the SOE's camouflage and special devices facility at the Frythe, a Victorian mansion in Hertfordshire. Lieutenant Colonel John Dolphin, who directed the facility's technical operations, later recalled the genesis came from observing how thoroughly German patrols searched buildings whilst largely ignoring natural features of the landscape. A boulder beside a road meant nothing. A stone in a field required no explanation. Rocks existed everywhere, in infinite variety, weighing anything from a few hundred grams to several tons, composed of dozens of different geological types depending on region. If an explosive could be made to perfectly mimic a stone native to the deployment area, it would achieve functional invisibility. The technical challenge, however, was formidable. The device had to replicate not just the visual appearance, but the weight, the surface texture, the acoustic properties when struck, the thermal characteristics, even the slight variations in color and weathering that actual geology displayed. It had to survive handling, transport, weather exposure, temperature fluctuations, and the occasional kick from a passing soldier or farm animal. The explosive needed to be stable enough for resistance operatives to carry and position safely, yet sensitive enough to detonate reliably when required. Development began in March 1941. The camouflage section at the Frythe collected rock samples from across France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Norway, anywhere British operations might require deployment. Geologists catalogued the samples by region, noting the specific limestone of Normandy, the granite of Brittany, the sandstone of the Loire Valley, the volcanic rock of the Massif Central. Each region demanded its own moulds, its own mixture of plaster and genuine stone aggregate, its own weathering patterns. The manufacturing process began with creating precise moulds from actual rocks, selected for their unremarkable appearance, neither so large as to be memorable, nor so small as to lack capacity for useful explosive payload. Engineers discovered that a rock roughly the size of a human head, weighing between 2 and 4 kilograms, provided optimal balance between explosive capacity and plausibility. The outer shell comprised plaster of Paris mixed with crushed stone from the target region, creating a matrix that looked, felt, and when struck, produced the dull thud characteristic of solid rock rather than the hollow ring of a shell. Shell thickness varied between 8 and 15 millimeters, depending on the size and intended payload. Inside this shell went the explosive itself, typically Nobel 808, a plastic explosive that could be molded precisely, remained stable across wide temperature ranges, and produced sufficient blast effect from relatively small quantities. Charges ranged from 450 grams for small devices intended to disable vehicles or damage railway tracks, up to 900 grams for larger rocks meant to destroy fuel bowsers or ammunition lorries. The detonator mechanism posed particular difficulties. It needed to function reliably after days or weeks of exposure, resist moisture and temperature variation, and trigger only when intended. 3 primary types emerged: pressure-release switches that detonated when the rock was moved or lifted, time delay mechanisms using chemical pencils that provided windows between 6 hours and 14 days, and remote detonators that could be triggered electronically from a distance up to 50 meters. The pressure-release variant proved most popular with resistance networks, as it required no timing precision and ensured detonation only when the enemy interacted with the device. Manufacturing occurred at several locations. The Frythe produced prototypes and specialized devices. Main production shifted to a converted furniture workshop in Aylesbury, where civilian workers, many of them women with experience in pottery and plaster work, assembled the devices under military supervision. Security was absolute. Workers knew they produced special items for overseas operations, but not their specific nature or deployment. Each completed device received individual inspection, weight verification to ensure it matched the reference rock used for the mold, and a coat of appropriate weathering using tea stains, mud, lichen cultivation, and careful abrasion to mimic years of exposure. Production figures remain partially classified, but declassified SOE records suggest approximately 2,500 fake rocks were manufactured between 1941 and 1944, with perhaps 60% deployed in France, 20% in the Low Countries, 15% in Norway and Denmark, and the remainder held in reserve or used for training purposes. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Deployment required careful coordination between SOE handlers in London and resistant cells on the ground. Packages arrived by parachute drop or submarine delivery, wrapped in oiled cloth, accompanied by photographs of actual locations where the devices should be placed. Operatives received specific instructions. Find the real rock shown in the photograph. Remove it at night. Position the fake in exactly the same location and orientation. Bury or destroy the original to prevent comparison. The substitution had to be perfect. If the real rock showed lichen on its north face, the replacement must too. If the genuine stone sat half buried in soil, the fake must match that positioning exactly. Resistance members reported the task felt surreal, exchanging rocks in darkness, knowing that this absurdly simple action might kill Germans days or weeks hence. The psychological effect on resistance networks proved as valuable as the tactical results. Members felt empowered by technology that turned the landscape itself into a weapon, that demonstrated British ingenuity and commitment, that proved the occupation forces remained vulnerable despite their apparent control. Documented uses remain incomplete due to the nature of the operations and the reluctance of survivors to discuss specific details even decades later. However, certain deployments entered the historical record through German reports, resistance memoirs, and post-war investigations. In June 1942, a fake rock positioned on the main supply route between Caen and Falaise detonated beneath a Wehrmacht fuel lorry, destroying the vehicle and blocking the road for 11 hours during a critical resupply operation. German investigators concluded the cause was unexplained explosion, possibly defective fuel tank, never suspecting sabotage because no evidence of conventional explosive devices existed at the scene. In September 1943, Norwegian resistance used pressure-release rocks to disable 3 separate vehicles carrying specialist radio equipment bound for German early warning stations along the coast. Again, German reports attributed the incidents to mechanical failure or mines, but no mines were ever found, and the roads had been swept immediately before the convoys passed. The devices proved particularly effective along railway embankments. Resistance operatives positioned them beside tracks, knowing that routine track maintenance would require workers to move or clear the rocks. When German railway workers or forced labourers disturbed the devices, the explosions disrupted service, created suspicion about sabotage, and prompted extensive searches that found nothing because the evidence had destroyed itself. The psychological impact on German troops and workers became cumulative. Reports from occupied territories noted increasing nervousness about routine tasks, reluctance to handle or move objects without cause, and a general erosion of the sense of security that occupation forces required to maintain control. The fake rocks contributed to an atmosphere of pervasive threat, where even the landscape might kill you, where nothing could be trusted, where the mundane act of kicking a stone from your path might be your last. German forces never developed effective countermeasures because they never fully recognized what they faced. Some intelligence reports noted an unusual pattern of unexplained explosions in occupied territories, particularly France and Norway, but investigators failed to identify the cause. A few damaged fake rocks were recovered after partial detonations, but by then the evidence consisted only of fragments of plaster mixed with real stone, materials that could have come from any building hit during bombardment. No comprehensive German analysis of the threat appears in surviving archives, suggesting the camouflage succeeded so completely that the enemy never understood they faced a deliberate weapons system rather than isolated incidents of unexplained ordnance or accidents. This represented the ultimate success for a covert device, remaining covert even after deployment, even after detonation, even after the war ended. British fake rocks existed in a class largely of their own, though context requires acknowledging what others attempted. German sabotage devices tended towards complexity and obvious militarization. Explosive coal designed to be shoveled into ship boilers, booby-trapped ammunition that detonated when fired, delayed action bombs disguised as supplies. These devices, whilst effective in specific contexts, required the enemy to actively take and use them. The genius of the fake rock lay in its passivity. It simply existed until the enemy provided the trigger through their own routine activities. American intelligence services adopted similar concepts, producing fake logs for Pacific theater operations and concrete camouflaged devices for European deployment. But British records suggest these were developed after observing SOE successes rather than independently. Soviet partisans used improvised camouflage extensively, but typically with cruder execution, explosives wrapped in mud and sticks rather than precision-moulded replicas. The sophistication of British geological mimicry, the attention to regional variation, the quality of the weathering and surface texture represented a level of craft that adversaries and allies alike struggled to match. The actual historical impact of fake rocks resists precise quantification, partly by design. Successful sabotage that looks like accident achieves dual purposes: physical damage and psychological uncertainty. Declassified SOE assessments credited the devices with destroying or disabling approximately 40 German vehicles, causing 17 railway disruptions of 6 hours or more, and forcing the diversion of security resources to investigate phantom threats. These numbers, acknowledged in the reports as necessarily incomplete given the covert nature of deployment, understate the broader contribution. The devices enabled resistance networks to conduct sustained sabotage campaigns without the exponential risk increase associated with conventional explosives. They denied the enemy the satisfaction of understanding what attacked them, creating a climate of ambient threat that degraded morale and operational efficiency. Perhaps most valuably, they demonstrated that technical sophistication could amplify the effectiveness of lightly armed resistance fighters, that British support was real and ingenious, and that the German occupation remained vulnerable in ways its commanders could neither predict nor prevent. The legacy extended beyond immediate tactical results. Post-war, the concept influenced the development of improvised explosive devices and camouflaged ordnance across multiple conflicts. The principle, make the weapon invisible by making it look utterly ordinary, became standard doctrine in special operations training. Modern examples include explosive devices disguised as rubble in urban warfare, improvised mines camouflaged as roadside debris, and surveillance equipment hidden in fabricated rocks that house electronic components rather than explosives. The British Museum's Imperial War Museum North holds one surviving example of a World War II fake rock, its plaster shell carefully preserved, the explosive long since rendered inert. The object sits in a display case, still looking unremarkable, still easy to overlook amongst more dramatic exhibits. Visitors often pass it by without a second glance, which seems entirely appropriate. Its purpose was always to be ignored, to be so perfectly ordinary that attention slid past without purchase. That it achieves this even now, even labelled and explained, speaks to the skill of its creators. Return now to that French roadside in August 1943. The motorcycle courier lies dazed in the ditch, ears ringing from blast overpressure, unable to comprehend what happened. The boulder that destroyed his machine has ceased to exist in recognizable form. Fragments of plaster and stone scatter across 20 meters of road, indistinguishable from any other debris. German investigators will arrive within the hour. They will photograph the scene, collect samples, write reports. They will conclude the courier struck a mine, though no mine fragments will be found. They will sweep the road and find nothing. They will question locals who will truthfully claim ignorance. The investigation will file the incident as unexplained ordnance, probable Allied mine, possible resistance activity, threat level unchanged. They will never know that what killed came not from beneath the road, but from beside it, that the weapon was positioned in plain sight, that its creation required geology samples and plaster moulds and careful weathering techniques, that it represented the calculated application of camouflage theory to explosives design, that hundreds more like it waited across France and Belgium and Norway, patient as the stones they mimicked. This is what total war demands and permits, the transformation of everything, even the landscape, into weaponry. The fake rock embodied a peculiar kind of violence, patient, impersonal, activated not by human agency, but by the enemy's own routine movements through occupied territory. It weaponized normalcy, turned the unremarkable into the lethal, and in doing so forced occupation troops to suspect everything or nothing. Most chose nothing, because suspecting every stone, every natural feature, every unremarkable element of the environment leads to paralysis. And so the rocks did their work, silent and patient, and occasionally devastatingly effective. They were, in the end, precisely what their creators intended: invisible threats hiding in absolute plain sight, killing without warning, leaving questions without answers. The German courier on that August morning never knew what hit him. His commanders never discovered what weapon had been used. The resistance operative who positioned the device remained unknown, unpunished, already planning the next exchange of stones. That was exactly how it was meant to work. The best sabotage is sabotage the enemy never recognizes as such, never learns from, never develops defenses against. On that metric, the humble British fake rock succeeded beyond measure, a weapon so perfectly camouflaged that even its detonation failed to reveal its nature, leaving nothing behind but wreckage, confusion, and one less courier delivering orders for the Wehrmacht.